Hey everybody, this is Rykard here again, and welcome to another Pokemon X and Y discussion video. With the last bit of information we received about these new games, we learned pretty much everything we're going to need to know about the new Fairy type, including what it resists, what it's weak to, and how it affects the other types in terms of what it hits super effectively, neutrally, and not very effectively. And this has been information we've been looking forward to basically since this type was introduced, so it's really nice to now have some concrete details on how this type affects other types in the game and what other types affect this type in the game. But with this recent bit of information, today's video is going to be all about the Fairy type and how it potentially can affect the metagame, specifically in comparison to the 5th gen metagame that we all currently know so well. So this video is going to be presented in 3 different parts. The first part being the overall metagame changes that me, as well as many of my viewers, since we had a very long discussion about this on my live stream yesterday, think about how this type is going to affect the metagame in terms of, what you're going to be seeing more of, what you're going to be seeing less of, and other things like that. The next part is going to be specifically dedicated to how this is going to affect dragon types. And there's actually a very, very good discussion about this, which I think could also potentially be continued more so in the comments. And then also some theoretical nerfs and buffs to the other types in the game due to the Fairy type being more common and possibly the other types that are now going to become more common due to the Fairy type being introduced. And that's a pretty long discussion in itself, but I'll try to gloss over that as quickly as possible just not to make this video extremely long. But with that, let's just jump into the first part right now, which are the overall metagame changes that the Fairy type is potentially going to have in the 6th gen competitive environment. So the most immediate and obvious change that is going to come out of the result of the Fairy type being introduced now is that there's going to be a less prevalence of Dragon and Fighting types as an offensive presence in the competitive environment. And for those of you that don't know, Fairy type is immune to Dragon type and also resists Fighting type. And this is actually very big because for the most part, Dragon and Fighting pretty much dominate the offense of most of the tiers, meaning that more often than not, there will be a Dragon type and there will be a Fighting type on pretty much every single team you run into in a competitive game, specifically in the OU tier. But as far as that's concerned, right now, most Pokemon of these types, for example, any Dragon type, could either set up a Dragon Dance and then sweep with Outrage if you get rid of your opponent's Steel type, or they can just choice them, Scarf or Specs, and just spam Draco Meteor, and that will just do a ton of damage to pretty much everything on your opponent's team, as long as they don't switch in their Steel type. But again, only Steel type resists that, which is why also Fighting is such an important attacking type as well, because Fighting is obviously super effective against Steel. You bring those in to get rid of the Steel types to pave way for the Dragon types to then sweep. And that's pretty much how it works from an offensive point currently, right now. But because of the introduction of the Fairy type, this is actually going to make this a much harder thing to do due to the fact that that type now resists both of these types, which is a very big deal, meaning that both of these types now have less of a chance of getting a sweep off because now there's one more thing in the game that they're going to have to worry about being resisted. However, as I say right here, adaptation will occur. This happened very quickly with 5th gen, with the prevalence of Ferrothorn being extremely common, almost used on every single team, which caused almost every special attacker in the tier of OU to start running Hidden Power Fire. That was the adaptation that occurred, and right now, Ferrothorn really isn't a problem, even though it was seen as a very good check to Dragon types very early on, due to the fact that it resisted their moves so well with its great defenses. But with the introduction of Fairy types, the adaptation that may occur will be that now both of these types, Dragon and Fighting, will now start running some Steel coverage moves or some Poison type coverage moves to combat the Fairy type that is now either going to be immune to or resist. So even though immediately it seems like these two types are going to be far less effective, they do have the type coverage. In fact, almost every single Dragon type, and we actually looked yesterday, has a Steel type move to go for to hit a Fairy type super effectively, and in some cases, specifically Haxorus, has Poison Jab to make use of to hit Fairy type super effectively, as well as most Fighting types also having access to a Steel or a Poison move. So they can hit them super effectively, but the adaptation will have to occur, which will result potentially in less type coverage overall from both of these types. But the next change that we assumed was going to occur was that there's going to be an increased use of Poison types now to combat the new Fairy type, because Poison types currently are only super effective against one type, which is Grass. But now that the Fairy type is introduced, they're super effective against 2 types, meaning that they are potentially going to be more prevalently used because now they have more things to be super effective against, which is very good for this type. It's something that was needed for a very long time. So as an offensive type, Poison type is an incredibly useful type now, or at least more useful than it was before. As far as a defensive standpoint is concerned, I now theorize that there was probably going to be a high probability of seeing Steel Fairy defensive cores in upper tiers due to the fact that they cover each other's weaknesses and resistances extremely effectively while also completely shutting down Dragon types. They really can't do anything about this, and your opponent is going to have to think a lot harder about how to deal with a Steel Fairy core as opposed to what it currently needs to in order to deal massive damage with their offensive Pokemon on their team. So there's a very high probability of this occurring in the upper tiers specifically, where you're probably going to see most of the Dragon types. Maybe many of them will lower in tier potentially due to the introduction of the Fairy type, but this is going to be potentially a very common pairing that you're going to run into. And then the last thing that could potentially happen as an overall metagame change is an increased use of Fire types because they resist Fairy moves. Now currently Fire types are very weak in the sense that they are hard to just use defensively because of the fact that Stealth Rock takes away 25% of their health as we switch in. Now we don't know if Stealth Rock is going to change at all at this point, but currently they're still a very weak defensive type despite the fact that they do have 5 resistances. But with the Fairy type, they now get a 6th resistance, which is very nice to have, so you could potentially see more defensive Fairy types coming in, defensive Fire types coming into play in the potential 6th gen metagame. So that is something to keep in mind. Now, as far as the Dragon types are concerned specifically, there are a lot of people going so far as to say that Dragon types are going to be useless now, and that's kind of an exaggeration. Just because there's an immunity to Dragon type moves doesn't mean they're going to be useless. A 140 base power Draco Meteor coming off Latios is still going to hit really hard. It's just that it has to be a little bit more cautious when using those moves. So Dragon types are essentially going to take a lot more skill to use right now than they currently do, because more often than not, it's pretty mindless. Like, let's be honest, guys. You set up Dragon Dance, you sweep with Outrage. It just works. You don't really have to think about it. It just works. So right now, with the introduction of the Fairy type, that's going to change things a little bit. So, I know I glossed over some of these points a little bit before, but the first thing that we all kind of decided upon that was going to be a huge impact with the introduction of the Fairy type is that choice-locked offensive dragons are now going to become less effective sweepers. And the reason being, obviously, because if they're choice-locked and a Fairy type comes in, they have to switch out, meaning they're less effective. And this just goes without saying pretty much. There's really not much else to say about this. So basically, like, Choice Specs Latios is going to be a lot less common now. Potentially, it's still really powerful, but it's potentially less common because of Fairy types being introduced. Same thing with, like, Choice Scarf Garchomp or Choice Scarf Moxie Salamence. Like, all those Pokemon are going to be a little bit less effective now that there is a type that is immune to their moves. So it's making them a little bit more balanced compared to the other types, which I think was the intent initially anyway. But as far as physical dragons are concerned, there's going to be a little bit more of a debate between what physical dragon move they go with, and in my opinion, this is basically between Outrage versus Dragon Claw. Obviously, there's Dual Chop, obviously there's Dragon Rush, but those are pretty much the only two you really see being used. Obviously, Outrage, for those of you that don't know, is a move that is 2 to 3 turns, and you're locked into it as soon as you click it for either 2 or 3 turns, depending on how long it lasts. But the reason why this move is now far less effective, even though it still hits very hard, don't get me wrong, but it's far less effective now because if you use Outrage, you're locked in that move, and if you kill your opponent on the turn you use Outrage, they're free to just bring in a Fairy type and just kill your dragon because you are locked in there. You have nothing to do in that situation. So they bring it in, you have to go for Outrage, they're immune to it, so they take no damage, and then they hit you super effectively with a Fairy move. So Outrage is going to be a little bit less effective, however, Dragon Claw is far less base power. Dragon Claw is 80 base power versus Outrage being 120. So Dragon Claw, even though it's less powerful, could potentially be a more viable option now because you're not locked into a move, but you also will lose out the potential to KO things that you normally might have KO'd with Outrage that you can't with Dragon Claw. So it's a much more difficult decision to make right now, and as far as we know, it might take a very long time for us to kind of finally figure out on which Pokemon and on what sets is Outrage going to be more useful than Dragon Claw or vice versa. So it's going to take a little bit more theory crafting to kind of figure out which is better for each dragon type that we currently know. And then the last thing to keep in mind, and kind of the biggest thing overall, and it's something that I've been saying since the fairy type was first introduced, is that now coverage against steel types versus coverage against fairy types will be an important choice on making most sets for dragon types, which is going to weaken their overall type coverage. So, for example, let's take Hydreigon. Hydreigon typically runs Draco Meteor, Earth Power, Fire Blast, and U-Turn on the typical choiced Hydreigon set. And as of right now, this pretty much covers everything that Hydreigon is ever going to need to run into, potentially. So, for example, Heatran obviously gets hurt by Earth Power. What was I going to say? Skarmory gets hit by Fire Blast. Ferrothorn gets hit by Fire Blast. And then you have your Dragon-type Draco Meteor to hit everything else in the game that doesn't obviously cover those. So overall, it's just a very effective set. However, with the Fairy type being introduced, and we don't really know the stats on a lot of the Fairy types yet, but with the Fairy type being introduced, what it does is it forces Hydreigon to now have to kind of choose. Like, obviously the set is still effective, but Draco Meteor is now no longer effective on Fairy types, so it's either going to have to go for Earth Power or Fire Blast. Now, who knows if, Fairy types just all have, like, really good special defense to take those hits, but either way, a Dragon type might consider having coverage for a Fairy type. So even though, say, the set currently is very good, it might consider maybe swapping out Earth Power for Flash Cannon in order to hit us Fairy type super effectively. But in doing that, it now has no way to hit Heatran because its other two moves are Draco Meteor and Fire Blast and U-Turn, or other three moves, sorry. So it has no way to hit Heatran, so it loses its overall type coverage. Similarly, if you get rid of Fire Blast for like Flash Cannon to hit a Fairy type super effectively, you now have no way of hitting Skarmory. So it kind of weakens the overall type coverage, which I think is a very good thing and causes a lot of dragon types to now have to think a little bit more about the sets that they run. And overall, it just kind of weakens them as a whole, meaning that you don't really have to worry so much about them because as long as you, as I said before, have a steel and a fairy type, you can pretty much handle the majority of the dragon types that you're going to run into. But as for a person using a dragon type, it's going to take a little bit more decision making on your part to figure out what is going to be the best fit for your team and for that dragon in particular. And now lastly, I wanted to talk about some theoretical buffs and nerfs to other types in the game as a result of the fairy type and potential types that you're going to be seeing more common as a result of the fairy type. So the first one that we decided that was going to be kind of a big deal is flying types getting a buff because almost all of them have access to Steel Wing, which is going to be super effective against fairy types. Now for the flying types that have access to Brave Bird, that's still more powerful than a super effective Steel Wing, and for the flying normal types that have access to Return, that is also more powerful than a super effective Steel Wing. But not every single flying type has access to Brave Bird, which is a bit unfortunate, and not every flying type is also paired with a secondary normal typing. So it potentially could be an option for a lot of flying types to now start running Steel Wing on offensive sets to have a way to hit fairy types super effectively, which we thought was pretty cool. As far as ground types and rock types are concerned, we saw these as being potentially more useful as an offensive type as well, due to the fact that there's probably going to be more poison types around, and the ground types obviously hit poison types super effectively, and almost every rock type in the game has access to a ground type move to hit poison types super effectively. Another type that we saw being buffed was actually Ghost and Psychic. I meant two types being buffed, because fairy types hit dark types super effectively, which resist both ghost and psychic moves. So because we have another type to hit those super effectively, ghost types and psychic types can now be used more often as an offensive type because fairy types can pave the way for a ghost or psychic type sweep. And the last thing to point out as far as an offensive buff is concerned is that water types could potentially have or be receiving an offensive buff in the sense that fire types as a defensive type will be more common, so water type will potentially be more common of an offensive type that we could use very effectively due to the potential increase of defensive fire types. As from a defensive standpoint though, steel, normal, and ice types all receive a buff due to the fact that fairy resists fighting. And this is just, something I mentioned a little bit earlier about how Steel Fairy could be a potential defensive core, but also Fairy Normal or Fairy Ice could also be a potential option as well, because now these types have another type to switch into to take the moves that they're weak to. And if you guys want to think about a Pokemon to kind of get hyped about, think about how kind of cool Cryogonal might be now, because it can now have a Fairy type that will be able to take the fighting type moves, also kind of increasing Cryogonal's usefulness, which is something to think about. I just kind of thought about that Pokemon specifically. And then also psychic types, again, get a boost because fairy types resist dark type moves, so psychic types have a move to switch in, type to switch into to resist the dark type moves that they're weak to. And as far as theoretical nerfs are concerned, the biggest one that we saw was actually bug type. And I know bug type is obviously resisted by fairy type, and that's not theoretical at all, that's a fact, but also because of the fact that we're also potentially seeing an increase in poison and fire types, both of which bug type does not hit, or hits for not very effective damage. So overall, bug type is just nerfed, because you're going to see more common types that resist it now. It actually has 6 types that resist it, which really sucks for bug. So that just type overall is just not going to be as effective as it was before. Similarly, ice types are a little bit less effective due to the fact that now there's less reason to use them to counter dragon types due to the fact that fairy types hit them super effectively. And ice type is weak to stealth rock, whereas fairy type isn't. So why would you use an ice type to hit a dragon type when a fairy type can do that much easier while also not taking damage from switching in? It kind of nerfs them a little bit. Also, potentially with the introduction of more defensive fire types, ice type is a less effective attacking type due to the fact that fire types are going to be resisting them. Also, electric becomes a little bit less effective due to the fact that ground types might become more common because of the prevalence of potential poison types. So that's just another thing to think about. That's a little double prediction right there, predicting ground types to be more common, predicting poison types to be more common. So that could potentially be a theoretical nerf to electric type. And then defensively, we actually saw a very high chance that grass types are going to be far less effective as a defensive type now, due to the fact that there's going to be more offensive poison types, which obviously hit grass super effectively, and more fire types from a defensive standpoint, but also potentially from an offensive standpoint. We don't know. But they're going to be more common now, so grass types are a little bit less effective. Now, there was that buff to grass types, meaning that they can no longer be put to sleep by sleep powder or things like that. Like, they're immune to those kind of moves now, which is kind of cool. Very interesting change, and I think that was, something that will really help this type out. But from just specifically a type standpoint, we saw that there was probably going to be less use of a grass type as a defensive type, which is something to keep in mind. But with all this theoretical things, being tossed about, obviously there's how does the flying type now having a steel move affect other types and things like that. So this is just a constant theorizing session of potential ideas that go around. But either way, these are just some theoretical buffs and nerfs. Feel free to post what else you think in the comments. But I have a question for all of you before we end this video, and it's basically, what Pokemon do you now see being more prevalent offensive and defensive threats as a result of the fairy type? And one of the biggest Pokemon that I saw from a defensive and offensive standpoint is going to be Heatran. Because Heatran quad resists fairy, it also resists dragon, and it can hit fairy super effectively with its potential stab flash cannon and things like that. So that is one Pokemon that I thought was going to be very useful in the potential 6th gen metagame, but that there are a ton of others that I probably could think of as well, but I just am interested to hear all of your thoughts. So leave that in the comment. Also, comment on this video. What do you think about the fairy type and all this kind of stuff that we've talked about today? But that is it for this video, everyone. So as always, thank you all for watching. Take care. Goodbye, and I will see you all next time.